we live in such a grief illiterate society. And, one of the things, and I don't know if you ever felt this, I certainly felt this because I got such a dose of grief at such a young age that, like, sometimes when people were really grief illiterate with me, you can either like be offended, and believe me, I've been offended or insulted, or I had a million reactions, but you can also go, oh, they don't know yet.
Testimony continued today in the most notorious criminal trial in which Dr. John Boyle is accused of killing his wife, Maureen.
The boy confidently told the jury it was his decision to testify against his father.
I heard a scream, I heard a thud. It's about this loud.
We, the jury, find the defendant guilty.
I decided at an early age that our trauma should not be what defines us. It's what we choose to do with it that does. I'm here to share my unique perspective on true crime, mental health, society, and popular culture, and always with a slight sense of humor. I'm Collier Landry, and welcome to my show. Mover Nation, what's going on? What's going on? What's going on? Wherever you may be and however you may be watching or listening, thanks for making me a part of your day. So today's episode is a deeply important one, and as we're diving into the topic of grief with none other than David Kessler, who is the world's leading expert on grief and loss. Now, David has dedicated his life to helping people navigate some of the most difficult moments, and today he's here to share his insights with all of us. In this conversation, we're going to explore the complexities of grief, how it shows up differently for everyone, and how to honor our own unique experience, and what society often gets wrong about the grieving process. Now, whether you're currently going through a loss or supporting someone who is, this episode is filled with compassion and wisdom. Now, David also is going to share some practical strategies for healing while reminding us that grief doesn't have a timeline. It can ebb and flow for years to come, and that's completely normal. Now, I know this conversation will bring clarity, comfort, and validation to so many of you, and that's why I'm so grateful to have David join the program. My guest today is David Kessler. I'm so grateful to have you here. You are the world's #1 expert on grief, and you have written a follow-up workbook to your best-selling book?
Correct. And thank you for having me. I'm grateful to be with you. It's I'm grateful to be here. And so many people said from the book, they love the theories, they love the ideas about excavating the pain to find the meaning, but they're like, but how? And so I really wanted to make it like I'm sitting down with you at your kitchen table. Mm-hmm. So we're just going to slowly talk through your grief.
I remember when I read the bio that came from your publicist, the little write-up, it's like that was your ultimate goal because you're so booked out schedule-wise. And so thank you for taking the time with us.
Of course.
You're so booked out schedule-wise, and what you have to contribute is so powerful that you wanted that sort of intimate conversation with the reader who is going through this obviously painful process. I want to sort of go back to your work leading up to this book or this workbook. You co-wrote, authored a couple of books with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, obviously the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief, and you talk about a sixth stage of grief, which I find particularly interesting. Could you sort of go into that?
Sure. First of all, I was honored to work with her and do a couple of books with her, and I always hear her whispering in my ear, "Tell them the stages aren't linear." So I always want to get that out of the way. There's no 5 easy steps for grief. That's like a mystery made up media thing. Grief is hard and brutal and messy. And her stages were denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And they don't have to be in any order. I can go through them all in an hour. That's just how it could work. And, it's interesting talking to you because when I was 13, I was in my mother was dying across the street where the hospital, we were in a hotel There was a fire, everyone ran out, and then shooting began. And we realized it was an active shooter that went on for hours. One of the first mass shootings in the US. So, talking to you, where two young boys who had their world changed by death and brutality and trauma in so many ways. So, our circumstances are so different, and yet I'm sure there's similarities. And, I grew up feeling broken and damaged and didn't know that there was going to be any hope. And over time, found things little by little that helped me and put me on this trajectory to not only help myself, but help others.
Mm-hmm.
And after decades of being, a grief specialist and helping so many people, I thought, oh, my grief's behind me. I mean, I'm sure I'll turn 90 someday and everyone around me will be dying. But I thought, like, the horrible parts of life are going to be behind me. And 8 years ago, my younger son died. And to re-experience grief, and a different grief at an older age versus that young age, I would watch myself not only be the person in grief, but the expert would sort of assess how things were doing in my mind. Yep, you're in denial. Yeah, you're angry. Yeah, you're depressed. And then when I started wrestling with acceptance, I'm like, well, there has to be more. And Kubler-Ross and I so often talked about acceptance isn't the end. Like, there's no finality in grief.
Yeah.
When people ask me, how long will I grieve? I always say, well, how long is a person going to be dead? Because if they're going to be dead for a long time, you're going to grieve for a long time. Now, it doesn't mean we always grieve with pain. Hopefully in time we grieve with more love than pain. But I wanted there to be more, and more turned out to be meaning, this idea of finding meaning. So I was honored that the Kubler-Ross gave me permission to even call a 6th stage meaning. And so that became the idea of the book and then the workbook.
There's something that just sticks out when you just said, having gone through, I mean, I'm sorry that you have experienced such pain and loss as well in your life. And it does allow us to shape meaning and hopefully do that through our work, right? But something interesting that you said that really stuck out to me is, I remember when I was in college and I said to my mother's best friend, who spoke to her right before she was murdered, I was going through a breakup with a girlfriend who I loved very much at the time, and, youth and whatnot, right? And I said, I really hope, I've been through so much pain in my life and grieved so much. Like, is there like a finite amount of this that I'll never have to go through this again? And she just looked at me and she said, no, honey, that's not the way the world works. I thought, oh, okay. That's a harsh reality.
It is a hard, and I'll tell you, like, I have an online grief group for, someone that's had a person die in their life. And I'll tell you, it's so hard, because the thing people say to me sometimes is they'll go, I can't take any more death. There can't be any more death. And I'll always feel like, oh my gosh, do I tell them the reality of planet Earth, that it's not over yet?
Yeah.
And like, it's going to continue. Like, look, hopefully not in some of the horrific ways we've all felt and you and I have felt, but, it is going to continue. And it's interesting. You either learn to sort of go with the waves, or you continue to fight them for another death, and you're like, I can't take any more.
Mm-hmm.
Or you go, yep, well, of course there's going to be more grief. And boy, have I learned to ride those waves.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember somebody said, don't push the river one time to me. And I thought that's a really strong analogy. Like you can't push the river. One of the things I find interesting about grief is, and especially in our society, and you mentioned mass shooting, one of the first mass shootings in the United States that you were unfortunately a part of in such a traumatic time in your life. But we're very judgmental about grief, and people look at this and they go, well, this person isn't grieving properly, or I don't see it written on their face, or they're not crying enough. Why do you think that is? And is there really an appropriate way to grieve?
We live in such a grief illiterate society. And, one of the things, and I don't know if you ever felt this, I certainly felt this because I got such a dose of grief at such a young age that, like, sometimes when people were really grief illiterate with me, you can either like be offended, and believe me, I've been offended or insulted, or I had a million reactions, but you can also go, oh, they don't know yet. Oh, the big people in their lives are, oh, yeah, no. I mean, I can remember one in particular you may appreciate, and I don't know how long it's been for you, but I can remember it was I think the 30th, marking the 30th year since my mother's death. And literally, I was with clinicians. And one of the clinicians said to me, 30 years, wow, and you still remember? And I turned to her and I said, oh, your parents are alive, huh? And she goes, well, yeah. And I went, yeah, I still remember. And I thought, that is something someone whose parents are alive and well would say, like, oh, you still remember after 30 years. Yes, it was not just a woman that hovered around me for parts of my early life. It's my mother. Yes. And of course, no one would say that except maybe someone whose parents are alive and well.
Yeah, it's it's an obtuse way to look at it for them, for sure. Yeah,
but they can't grasp it. It hasn't happened to them. They don't even know the language yet.
Yeah. How do you coach people through who are struggling with that, who are not the acceptance of others or the understanding of others? What do you tell them? Just shirk it off, just keep moving on, or just like what would your advice be to people who are going through that?
It is an ongoing process, and I would say a few things like, first of all, we always get to have our feelings. You get to have your reaction, and we get to do it. So first, I always say, allow those feelings. I might also say, at some point in your grief, if you choose, you can say, thank you. You can say, ooh, that's not helpful. Another favorite thing I'll say is sometimes, ouch. And people go, ouch, what? And I'll go, oh, I know you meant that well, but it didn't work out well. And the advanced technique, and I say, look, you shouldn't have to be educators. And yet, people in grief turned out to be the educators. I might educate. I might, sometimes I do it like as if I'm like a coach on the basketball team going, psst, I know you think that's helpful, but you're going to have other people who are going to die in your life. Good thing you said it to me so we can work this through. Don't ever say that again. Here's something that's more helpful. Like on grief.com, which is my website, the site that's most visited, the page, is the best and worst things to say to people in grief. We don't know what to say. We don't know what to say. Now, here's the advanced class in this. The advanced class is, what if it's just a question or a statement? And I'll give you an example. I was at my son's grave. I was at his grave fairly recently. I got in the car my phone rang. I picked it up like it was just another phone call. And my friend, a close friend of mine, said, "Hey, what are you up to?" And I went, "Oh, just at David's grave." And he went, "Still?" Now, luckily, in that moment, and I've had years of doing this, I could say to myself, what if it's just a question? And I went, "Yeah, still, probably going to do this for the rest of my life. What are you up to today?" And that was the conversation. Like, I just answered it. It was just a question. I didn't need to give him a lecture on how grief illiterate he is. I'm just like, yeah, still, probably for the rest of my life. What are you up to today?
Yeah. Wow. Do you think that he sort of maybe was taken aback and maybe, oh, maybe I should rethink?
Maybe. And one of the things is all these things about how do we know what to do, how to react. I got to tell you, I love putting this workbook together because I was just doing it in a segment right before you with a group of therapists that I work with, that we were going through one of the early checklists. And can I just really, real quick, just read you something? Because it's fascinating to think about, like, I have it in 3 segments. I made this so easy. I wanted people, like, there's questions that are deeper, but I wanted people to, like, have checklists if they just wanted to go into this. Like, just think about this, and especially think about, I love people who said they're going to do this early in their grief and then they're going to do it again later. This is a checklist. My grief hasn't hit me yet. Another one is time will not change this pain. My grief is right on time. I should be over it by now. My grief is lasting too long. I'm stuck in my grief. It's time to move on. I'm backsliding. My grief is healing. My grief has become manageable. My grief is a part of me, but doesn't define me. Like, think about those. Do you have any that you're like, oh, okay, yeah, I could see which ones I would check?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would probably check most of those.
Right. And it's interesting. Then I have the same checklist and I said, check that same checklist, but this time what your family, friends, and society thinks you should be. So it's interesting to begin to see, oh, here's me, here's what they want, here's what, what do other people want from me in my grief? And let me figure out where I am separate from them.
I am someone who is slightly neurodivergent, and I find putting things down on paper to be extremely helpful in how I process things. When I analyze a relationship or a breakup, it's weird, I guess, but it's just how I process things. This is the timeline of events because I have such a good memory because of what happened to me and with my father and testifying in court. So I have this sort of very detailed memory of things. So I just list everything, and then that's how I process. So having something like that where I can compare and contrast, okay, this is what they want me to think. This is how I really feel, or this is how they want me to feel. Because would you say that grief is so uncomfortable for so many people who haven't gone through it that they want to make them, it's more of a reaction about how they can feel better around the person grieving?
That happens so many times. I mean, look, our grief makes other people uncomfortable. And maybe even lovingly, they want us to be recovered from our grief so that they don't have to deal with it anymore. They don't have to, look, when I think about they don't want to feel what we're feeling, I don't want to feel it. I'm sure, we would rather have different lives too.
Yeah.
But once in a while, someone will say to me, David, my spouse, my sister, my best friend, they had this horrible tragedy. I just want the old them back. And I'll go, yeah, I'm sure they want the old them back, but we'd have to unwind reality to get the old them back, and we'd have to bring back people from the dead. And since we can't do all that, I think they're having to accept who they are now. And I think we got to accept who they are now. And all this is just as true for us. Listen, someone said to me, it was really sweet. They said, David, I bought the new workbook, but I just want you to know I can't open it yet. And I go, okay, just curious, what's your plan for it right now? And they said, I'm just going to put it on the shelf for now. And I said, can you just tell me a little bit more about like, what's that resistance or the feelings about opening it now, or just not the right time? What's your thoughts on that? And they said, I'm not ready to go into the pain. And I said to them, oh, I so wish you could put your pain on the shelf with the book.
Yeah.
You could put the book on the shelf, but the pain is with you and it's in you. And what I love, like what you said, is like the book is the place, the workbook is the place to take the pain out of you and put it on paper. And you get to witness your own grief. You get to see what your pain looks like.
For those who are going through a loved one who is grieving, right? So, spouse who's lost, a spouse whose other spouse has lost their mother or father, they've lost their mother-in-law. How do you help them navigate that new relationship? Because this is where we are now. We can't go back. The person cannot be, brought back alive again. They won't be living again. They're in a different form now, whatever anyone's spiritual beliefs are. But how do you really work with a spouse who has sort of lost that connection because of the grief?
It's a simple answer and a really hard thing to do. I always say, love them. And the response I get is, well, I do love them, but they need to get into a group. They need to do this. They need your book. They need this. Da, 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 da. And I go, I know you think that's loving them where they are, but they're not quite where they should be, kind of conditional love. And the answer has to just be, you love them. And then I tell people to do something that confuses them and works really well. If you think your loved one's not grieving right, tell them, I love you, I'm here with you, and I really appreciate how you're doing your grief. And I know for you, you're doing it right. And the person will go, David, I can't say that. They're not doing it right. But I'll go, you'd be surprised if you love them and tell them you know they're doing the best they can. Don't use those words. They're kind of overused now.
Sure.
But just, look, I see you struggling to engage in your grief. And I know that, I just love how you're just doing it. People melt and go, you too? Because I've been feeling, and then they open up. Like when we just love them, they open up. When we tell them they're doing their grief wrong, they shut down.
You get more with honey than you do with salt, right?
Absolutely.
It's something that's I think become and there's been several articles that I've read about this recently, but there's a strong trend with a lot of younger Americans who are not having children quite yet or having children later on in life, but are turning more to pets and pet grief. And I can remember I had a friend who had a cat whose name was Kitty for 20 years. And the same year, both of his parents died. And he said to me, he comes to me because obviously what I've been through, and hey, can you help me? And, I just need an ear. I'm like, of course. He goes, I feel really guilty because when my parents died, I knew that they were going to pass and I accepted that. But when Kitty died, I couldn't function. I couldn't leave my house for a week. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I was always sad. Why do you think that is, that we've sort of the connection with pets and people? I'm sure you must cover this.
Yeah, there's a lot of, and first of all, just to unpack grief in general, just a bit for folks, I always say grief is always a change we didn't want. And it's always the death of something. So I think about it this way. Grief comes in all these forms. A breakup is the death of that romantic relationship. A divorce is the death of that marriage. A betrayal is the death of the trust. A job loss is the death of that place, that paycheck. Pet loss is the death of that sweet, companion that you had daily. Even things like narcissism feels like the death of yourself. So it's always a death of something. And when we talk about pet loss, look, my belief on that is if the love is real, the grief is real. And there's a lot of factors, like in your friend's case, the reality could be you've done a lot of the anticipatory grief work. Your parents are going to die someday. We all psychologically get ready. And you and I didn't have that chance. But, many people do. Their parents live long lives. They see it coming. There's lots of time. We're not as prepared for a pet loss. Your parents, your brother, your other folks may live far away. Your pet is like at your feet daily, in your bed, at your door. Their absence is loud. And I teach something called security in our grief. I hope to get people to feeling secure in their grief. I'm secure in the grief around the death of my son. You can talk about your mother to me, and it doesn't take away from my grief. Like all our griefs get to live together in this world.
Yeah.
There's enough room. The world is big enough for all our griefs. In the same way, if your friend walked in and started talking about the death of his cat named Kitty, which is so cute, like it doesn't take away from mine. There's no insult. There's no upset. There's no how dare you, my son died. Like I'm secure in my grief. And it's interesting, even after my son died, months later, sweet, sweet dog of ours died after 17 years. And people are like, which was the worst? And I'm like, why am I choosing again? Like, I think they're just two horrible losses that happen in my life. They don't need to be compared. They don't need, people always ask, which is the worst? And I always go, yours. The one you're going through right now is the worst. That's all we can feel.
Do you think people can sort of become, I think there is maybe a misunderstanding or a miscommunication or a misinterpretation that people who have gone through massive trauma, massive grief, almost become immune to it?
Well, not my experience. Here's how I would say it. I do more work now online. Most of my work is I do online grief groups. I got 26. We've even got Death by Murder as one of the groups. I have a grief educator program where I train therapists and coaches and folks who want to turn their pain into purpose. And a few years ago, I was doing the 30 cities, 3 countries on the road thing. And I would go into one hotel room after another, the big hotel meeting rooms. There'd be 200-300 people there. And then in the meeting room next to us would be the realtors. Down the hall would be the nurses. And after everyone left, the staff would go, hey, what were you teaching? And I'll go, grief? Why do you want to know? And they went, oh, because your group was laughing the most. And I could see them not understanding that. I think when you've gone through enormous trauma, enormous pain, it can constrict you. But if you get support and help, it can expand you. It's the difference between the post-traumatic stress or the post-traumatic growth.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, I think people are so expanded after tragedy for pain, but they can also be expanded for joy. I mean, I don't take anything for granted. I mean, when we talk about meaning, people think, what's this guy talking about meaning in grief? There's no meaning in my mom's death. There's no meaning in your mother's death. No, of course not. The meaning is what we do after. Your life is practically a statement about meaning and, what you've done and how you've held your tragedy in the world is deeply meaningful. And I think it's important we name those things.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's very kind of you to say. As with you, you mentioned a little bit about narcissism. We have a mutual friend, Dr. Ramani Durvasula, and being the death of self. What did you mean by that?
There's a lot of occurrences in life, our old wounds, our trauma, maybe who and how we engage in the world. Many of us in our childhood are raised to be other-oriented and make ourselves disappear. We can also grow up and get involved in people who kind of make us disappear. Mm-hmm. And those can be people who can be, more on the spectrum of real narcissistic abusive relationships. And slowly and gradually, you disappear. Mm. And I often say, it's the only death we can come back from. Like, you're not getting your mom back. I'm not getting my mom back. Not happening this lifetime. Yeah. No how, no way.
Yeah.
After being with a narcissist, there is healing. There is finding yourself again. It is very hard. I don't want anyone to think, oh, it's easy. You're just there again. It's tough. When you've been beaten down, that's very hard to come back from. But you can do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've obviously seen that a lot with people who've gone through these situations. As someone who personally has a lot of experience in the prison system and incarceration system in this country, being what my father did, I see a lot of, for lack of a better word, systemic problems, like perpetual repeating of patterns and things of that nature. Do you think that if we had a better handle on grief, we might be a little more immune to repeating those patterns if we really got a sense of that and got a handle on what our grief is and processing that?
Absolutely. One of the questions people ask, and it's sort of another form of your question, is why? Why bother with the whole grief work thing? Why bother with healing these? I mean, what's the problem with just, sweeping them on the rug and just living your life? Mm-hmm. Well, we start a new relationship with the bricks of our old relationship that just went wrong. We, create patterns. We try to heal ourselves the same way. We make the same mistakes over and over again. I mean, how many of us have felt like, why am I doing this? I'm making decisions out of my abandonment. I'm making decisions out of my fear. I'm making decisions out of, my scarcity. I'm I'm punishing because I've been punished. Wounded people wound people. So it's so true of our prison system, and it's true of our lives. And I got to tell you, there's a lot of us that have bars on the outside. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of us that have bars on the inside. Yeah.
Some people are destined to be thrown in the oubliette of their own creation, if you will.
Right.
We see that a lot. What would you say? What would be your one piece of advice to take away? Obviously, get the workbook, read your materials, join your groups.
And by the way, as you and I were talking,
this
is what it looks like.
Yes.
And I just want people to see this because With AI now, there's copycats out there. Get the Finding Meaning workbook by David Kessler. If you go to griefbook.com, it'll give you links to Amazon and Barnes & Noble and your independent bookstores. Here's the one piece. What we run from pursues us, and what we face transforms us. And it's hard work. And that's why I hope with this new workbook to give people, like people here now, you got to do your grief work. What is my grief work? Well, it's any time you attend to your grief. And then people go, I don't know what that means. I mean, I wanted the workbook to be something easy you could do after the death of a breakup, after the death of a marriage, after all these losses, the death of a pet, all of them, obviously the death of a person, no matter what death it is, you can just add that in the workbook and do it on those losses to get to know you and to heal yourself. And, when I think about the word healing, people go, never, because they have like a story that healing means forgetting. I think of healing as I no longer make decisions from that moment. I mean, look, my guess is at times in your life, like me, you've made decisions out of your tragedy, out of your pain, out of your mother's murder. I've made decisions out of that abandonment, that scarcity, that tragedy, that what's the point? I mean, there's a million decisions, and I want freedom, not just, freedom, like we say, from the outer bars, but freedom from the inner bars, that I don't have to make a decision from my abandonment anymore. I'm free. I'm doing my healing work.
That's very powerful. That's very powerful. My guest today is David Kessler. He is the author of Finding Meaning, Grief Workbook, Tools for Releasing Pain and Remembering with Love. He is the world's #1 expert on grief, an author and a speaker. David Kessler, thank you so much for joining the program.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And I'm grateful for all you do in the world.
Likewise. Thank you. Mover Nation, I hope that today's episode with David Kessler has brought you guys some comfort and some clarity. Look, grief is universal, but it's also deeply personal. And as always, you can take what resonates with you and, just leave the rest. And remember that you don't have to navigate this journey alone. Now, please be sure to check out the show notes in today's episode for links to David's work, his new workbook, and also his companion workshop to the workbook when you purchase it on Amazon or wherever you get your books from. If today's conversation has helped you in any way, please share it with someone who might need it too. And Mover Nation, please, if you could, rate and review this podcast on Apple and Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from. And please leave us a 5-star review. It really helps. If you're watching on YouTube, please check out the links below and also give us a thumbs up, like, subscribe, follow, and share with others. It really helps the show grow. On that note, I'm Collier Landry, and I'll see you on the next one. Mover Nation, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much to all my channel members and Patreon supporters. And for more exclusive content, behind the scenes videos, monthly VIP meet and greets, and watch parties, please consider supporting me on Patreon or by becoming a YouTube channel member. If you like this video, check out this one right here or this one right here. And don't forget to like and subscribe because it helps with the algorithm. On that note, I'm Collier Landry. I'll see you on the next one. Good girl, Marisol. Good girl.